Motörhead's Lemmy Kilmister could sing anything. Anything!
You take my life, but I'll take yours too!
And while Lemmy rarely ever been ranked as a top vocalist, his unique style could make any song he sang his own.
Talking about me, Lemmy's got the voice in rock and roll. I think rock and roll is that voice.
And to prove it, let's take a look at some of the most surprising, challenging, and downright awesome covers Lemmy ever did to see that Lemmy's voice had something much more than just a rasp to it, and then discuss a little something about it overall. Here you go.
God save the Queen!
Pretty much everyone knows Lemmy to be the master of performing iconic punk rock songs, which of course is pretty understandable given the fact that Motörhead were able to bridge the gap between punk rock and metal like no other band could back in the 1970s. But at the same time, Lemmy was able to bend the songs which you'd never imagine could work for his voice in a way like no other singer could.
Wangle a new dangle on live.
Oh! No, Bender, the other way!
I like him better this way.
And one of the most unexpected of those was Iron Maiden's The Trooper, which Lemmy recorded together with Phil Campbell, Rocky George, Chuck Wright, and Chris Slade.
You take my life, but I'll take yours too! You fire a musket, but I'll run you through!
This version, although of course it does not feature any of Bruce Dickinson's operatic vocals, still sounds unbelievably organic, despite it, in my opinion, actually being one of the weakest covers Lemmy ever did together with Phil Campbell. Simply because it was recorded when Lemmy was already in his 60s and thus does not really feature any of his iconic high-pitched screams, which are actually quite impossible to replicate.
I don't wanna live forever!
By the way, we'll talk about those screams and what makes them so special in a moment, but the thing is that even while not really utilizing his voice to its fullest, Lemmy somehow was able to turn the Trooper into a grittier and dirtier beast. His raw and snarling delivery stripped the song of its polish, and somehow it worked, making it what the Trooper would actually sound like after spending years in the trenches of Crimea.
The little body's laying on the ground, and then the Russians fire another round.
And the same goes for another heavy metal classic, Breaking the Law. Rob Halford's vocals on the original are sharp, dynamic, packed with attitude, and yet are very melodic. Lemmy, on the other hand, brought his own brand of rough-edged swagger to this track.
There I was completely wasted, out of work and bound.
And here's the thing, Lemmy's performance, which is obviously done quite differently, actually emphasized the gritty realism of this track's lyrics perfectly, turning it into a street-level anthem for outlaws everywhere. And most importantly, Lemmy was somehow able to make Breaking the Law, one of the most iconic Judas Priest songs ever, sound like a Motörhead song. Something which no one, despite the whole fact that this track has been covered gazillion times by enormous amount of bands, was able to do before that.
Breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law.
And by the way guys, I hope that everyone understands that I'm not really comparing Lemmy's performance of these tracks with their iconic originals. I mean, in all honesty, no one would be able to top Bruce Dickinson's or Rob Halford's rendition of those two tracks. But what I'm talking about here is how Lemmy was somehow able to make the songs which you would never expect could work for his voice sound incredibly well, both for him and for the sound Motörhead propagated throughout the years. And by the way guys, since we're having a little break here, I just wanted to point out that only around 30% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to the Metal Pilgrim channel, so if you still haven't done so, and especially if this is not the first video you're watching on the show, I would really appreciate it if you'd consider doing it right now. Let's continue building this amazing heavy metal community together. Pretty much everyone knows that the boys from Metallica are some of the biggest Motörhead fans in the world of metal, and therefore I simply cannot even imagine what it was like for them to not only perform with legendary Lemmy on stage, but also to hear their own songs interpreted by the one who actually inspired them to write those. And while most people of course know Motörhead's rendition of Enter Sandman, Lemmy's ability to bend the songs and make them sound unbelievably Motörhead-like is most audible in his rendition of the song Whiplash from the early Metallica catalog, which still had quite a lot in common with early Motörhead. And in fact, Lemmy was able to make it so Motörhead-like that Whiplash became the song which Motörhead even got a Grammy for. The only Grammy in Motörhead's entire career. Which I think is a freaking shame.
Shame!
Because they definitely deserved it a gazillion times for a lot of their own material before that. But still. And the same thing Lemmy was able to do with Rolling Stone's Jumpin' Jack Flash, which once again somehow fitted Motörhead's sound quite well. Which, in my opinion, is the craziest thing ever. Because it was actually Lemmy's voice which was able to make Metallica's Whiplash, the Rolling Stones' Jumpin' Jack Flash, and let's say Judas Priest's Breaking the Law, three completely different tracks, all sound undeniably Motörhead-like. And this was in fact the magic of Lemmy's unique voice, in my opinion. And the last song which I'd like to cover before we go into the conclusion here is possibly one of the best, in my opinion, covers Motörhead have ever done, at least in the latter part of their career, and definitely one of the most bittersweet ones in the world of metal. Motörhead's perfect rendition of the song which I, once again, didn't really think would be able to be covered like this, David Bowie's Heroes, which was actually one of the very last songs Lemmy recorded on this earth, and which sadly later on became a perfect bittersweet tribute to both him and David. And here's the thing, I know that it might be just me being emotional here, because Motörhead is actually one of my favorite bands, and Lemmy meant a lot to me, and meeting him was always, you know, a very special thing for me personally. But in my opinion, not only was Lemmy able to make Heroes sound like a undeniably Motörhead song, which we just discussed he was able to do with pretty much any track, but I actually believe that Lemmy's voice was able to open this track up from a completely different angle, making it a bit more rough around the edges, and thus making it fit its lyrics and mood possibly even better than the original one. And yeah, I know that it may sound like a blasphemy to most. Lemmy's ability to make pretty much any song sound like his own was extraordinary. Actually, after a young me first heard Motörhead's rendition of Cat Stretch Fever, for years after that I believed that it was a Motörhead original. And to this very day I actually believe that it is the best and the only true version of that track. And here's the thing, Lemmy actually had one of the most consistent vocal distortions in the history of music. And many may mistake this distortion for his way of trying to hide his inability to sing, which in reality, underneath that distortion, pretty much always lied a nearly perfect pitch, which allowed Lemmy to do some pretty extraordinary things. For on pretty much every scream he ever did in his career, especially on the early records, although it may sound as just noise to some, Lemmy was actually able to perfectly hit exactly the note which would suit best for that track. And by the way guys, I actually did a special episode on how Lemmy developed that rasp in his voice in the early days of Motörhead, which will be on the end screen of this YouTube video, so if you haven't seen it, just watch it afterwards. But in reality, even though he was self-taught, it was this unique ability by Lemmy Kilmister, which made pretty much any iconic Motörhead song an impossible one to replicate and cover while doing it justice, while Lemmy himself was actually able to bend pretty much any track to his will. And this, my friends, has actually made him a rather unique singer in the world of metal. But anyways, what do you guys personally think about Lemmy's voice? Please let us know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching this short video, guys, and we will prevail. Slava Ukraini! Because we are Motörhead!